Remember that populations represent a group of individuals of the same species interacting within a given area. Now we're going to look at all individuals of all species interacting in a given area, which is a community. Ecosystems have a abiotic component, which are all the non-living things, rocks, water, soil. The biotic component is the community, the living things. You can look at communities in different ways. You can talk about the bird community, just birds, the tree community. You can also look at what are called guilds. Guilds are groups of species, different species that have similar niches. Remember that a niche is the role of an organism in a community. And so an example on the photo here is a guild in the Serengeti savannas of Africa. And this guild includes large herbivorous animal species like gazelles and wildebeests. You can also talk about plant species that tend to occur together. We don't call them guilds, we call them associations. So in the Piedmont of Virginia, in the mountains, we have the oak hickory community, make oaks and hickories, or in high elevation mountains, spruce fir association. Communities are structured. They have a physical structure, which includes what they look like. Do they have big, tall things like trees? Do they have small, short, herbaceous things like grasses? Do they have shrubs? What is their life form? Also, are they layered? Do they have different layered structures, like they have trees in the upper story and shrubs in the understory and herbaceous plants in the on the forest floor close to the ground? Also, as you walk through it, the community, does it change in composition? Does it have a lot of, say in a forest, does it have a lot of gaps in the canopy? Biological structure includes what the biota are. Okay, which species are the most dominant? Are they the biggest, the most abundant? Are they frequently encountered? And another component of biological structure is richness. How many different species are there? Another component of structure includes complexity. What are the number of different interactions between species? Is the food web really complex, or is it simple? Are there a lot of predator-prey relationships? Are there different mutualistic relationships? Are there parasitic relationships, competition, all part of community complexity? So here's an example of what I mean by physical structure. You could see that you have different types of life forms. There's a good bit of horizontal structure here because you walk through this and then all of a sudden you get into the shrub thicket and then you go up to these rocky areas. And it has a variety of different life forms, right? Community structure varies quite a bit between different biomes, ecosystems. Tropical rainforests have high diversity, especially of plants, because they have lots of layers, vertical structure. There's very little vertical structure in prairies, and so they tend to be very simple and often do not have high diversity. Physiognomy is a component of physical structure. It's what it looks like. What does this look like compared to this, and that? Life forms, again, Main life forms are trees, shrubs, grasses. Stratification is layering. Lots of layering here. Not so much there. Patchiness too. Is there a lot of horizontal variation? Go through and it's very uniform. That's not very patchy. Go through and there's lots of different areas with different types of plants. That's patchiness. And so some examples of vertical structure, layering of vegetation, stratification of water by temperature. You have warm surface waters and cool deep water. Water depth. That's an example of stratification. The littoral zone and the pelagic zone with more layers. Some types of animal communities are highly dependent on the plant communities that are there, especially with respect to vertical stratification. The more layers of trees, shrubs, middle story trees, ferns, grasses, the more different types of layers, the more birds you have, because birds tend to feed and nest in different layers. The more layers, the more bird species. Horizontal structure includes how dispersed are the different microhabitats within the community. When a tree falls, it creates a gap. And what that does, it opens a hole in the canopy, which increases horizontal structure. There's more variability as you walk through. You suddenly come upon a fallen tree with a lot of downed wood and a big hole in the canopy where lots of light comes through. The more patchy or heterogeneous a community is with respect to its plant and abiotic structure, the more niches for animals. Another thing too about communities is they intergrade. One community intergrades with another. These are called ecotones. The boundary line, if you can draw one, is an edge, and everything around that edge is called the ecotone. These are where two communities meet, and you can see examples in this photo. You have this community, the pond, and the flooded vegetation around the pond, and you have an ecotone between the two. And then you have this shrub community and an ecotone between this herbaceous plant community and the shrubs, and then another ecotone back here between the forest and the shrubs. Ecotones are often pretty diverse with the number of species, have high species richness because species often need more than one type of habitat. And so they move between the two communities in the ecotone. Frogs, they live in the water, but they come out to bask in the sun. Turtles do the same thing. All right, so you're going to find frogs and turtles moving back and forth. Deer will come out in here to browse or graze, and they'll go back in the forest for cover. Biological structure now is what is the actual structure of the species in the community. How many individuals of a species are there? Which ones are dominant? And that might be, for trees, what takes up the most area in terms of trunk space? How much do they weigh, biomass? Or how much of the area do they cover, like canopy cover? Frequency is how well distributed the species are in the community. Do species only occur in a small little corner of the community, or are they found throughout? And then diversity. Diversity includes how many species are there, but also how evenly are they spread in terms of abundance among the different species? You might have 5 species, but if 90% of them are just one of those species, that's less diverse than, say, if you had 20% among the 5 species evenly distributed. And then finally, we have ecological complexity. How many interactions are there? Obviously, the more species you have, the more potential you have for interactions. So often, biological diversity and biological structure and ecological complexity are often closely related. Another thing about communities is you have interactions between species in different ways. Mutualism. We looked at mutualism with algae and fungi that comprise a lichen. You have plants and their pollinators. You have, if you remember the fungal unit, you have fungi that invade tree roots and help the trees get water and nutrients, and the fungi get carbohydrates. So mutualism is a win-win situation. You can also have commensalism. In your reading, they mention that birds' nests are often put on top of trees. The trees don't even sense that they're there, if trees can sense something, because they're light. They don't do any damage to the tree at all. So a cup nest on a tree is nothing to the tree, but it's a place for the bird to lay the nest. So that's commensalism. Barnacles are small little animals that can attach to the back of a whale. The whale is not impacted at all by the barnacle, but the barnacle gets a place to attach. Amensalism is when you have one organism that is not impacted, but another organism is negatively impacted. Elephants walk through the forest. Elephants are big. When they walk, they kill plants and bugs and mice if they aren't scared of them first. And the elephant doesn't even know it's not impacted, but the other ones are damaged or dead. Predation is a win-lose relationship. One thing eats, another thing gets eaten. Parasitism is also a win-lose relationship. The parasite gets food or something from the host, which loses food or something else. Like mistletoe is parasitic on trees. It taps into the xylem and gets water. So the mistletoe wins and the tree loses. Typically, parasites have evolved with their host so that the parasites don't kill the host, because if they do, they lose their source of resources. Competition, when we think about competition in human relationships, for example, go to a basketball game, one side's going to win, one's going to lose, or a baseball game, right? There's 3 outcomes. Like Yogi Berra said, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, sometimes it rains. But it's a lose-lose relationship in ecology, typically because you use energy to compete. And even though you might win more than another species, which might lose, there's still a loss of energy in having to compete. In other words, in natural ecosystems, it's easier to conserve energy by not having to compete. And species tend to shy away from competition. In ecosystems, there are trophic levels, and this is basic ecosystem ecology as well as community ecology, but you have producers, that make food. These are typically plants. You have primary consumers that eat plants, herbivores, and you have secondary consumers that eat primary consumers. And of course, this fox also can be a primary consumer if it feeds on grapes or some fruit. And then you have things that eat dead things. These are decomposers, fungi and bacteria primarily. And so in communities, you have food chains, and food chains are simplistic representations of the trophic levels, going from producers to consumers, primary consumers to secondary consumers to the decomposers that recycle the nutrients, that feed the producers, and the chain goes on. Food chains, though, can be pretty simplistic because in communities, there are usually lots of feeding options, and we call these food webs. And you can see that you have certain types of organisms that tend to be at the bottom of the food chain, and then your top predators up here, but there are lots of options along the way. Then we can look at dynamics, which means how do communities change over time? And when you have a disturbance or a damage to a community, it'll recover. And that process of recovery is called succession. And in many cases, it's often difficult to see disturbances happen within a community because they happen at a small scale. But succession can happen all at once if you have a big disturbance, or it can happen little by little if you have small little patchy disturbances. And then the last thing we'll look at is succession over long periods of time that are due to climate change. So succession, if you want a definition, is a directional change in a community over time. And this field here is going to eventually, if abandoned, grow back into something like this. It'll have typical stages, even though it's a continuum. And each stage is called a sear, each stage is called a searal stage, and this continuum called a sear. And species come and go along different segments of this sequence or of succession called a sear. You can have succession that starts on bare land, i.e. bare rock. Like if a volcano erupts, eventually that volcanic lava field will be colonized. It takes a long time. More commonly, we see secondary succession. This is when the vegetation is removed, but the soil is still intact. And the photo I showed you of the old field is an example of old field succession, an abandoned field that comes eventually back into a shrubby area, and a pine forest, and then a hardwood or oak forest in our region of Eastern North America, if you were there. Then you can also have succession where you have a forest, the trees are removed, but the trees can sprout from the cut stumps. We call that clear-cut succession. Typically, succession will keep going until you reach a stable endpoint. In some cases, you have an unstable endpoint. Along the way, you have pioneer and climax species, species that occur early in succession. The first colonizers are called pioneers, and the ones that come in last are the climax species. And for example, forests here, the last remaining climax dominants are oak and hickory. So this primary succession starts on rock, sand, volcanoes, dunes, retreating glaciers. What are the pioneers? Lichens, mosses, algae. In ponds, you can have newly formed waters that are poor nutrients. They're oligotrophic. Eventually, though, they'll fill in, and succession leads to a pond teeming with algae. These are called eutrophic conditions, rich in nutrients. And here's an example of secondary succession in the Piedmont. This is in North Carolina, Piedmont, a study that looked at first year, second year, third year, all herbaceous plants going on into 5 to 20 years, you get pines, and then eventually invasion by hardwoods, resulting finally into an oak hickory climax. Pine dominance, and then eventually hardwood climax. As succession of plants go, so do animals. Some animals need certain types of cereal stages, like the veery thrush needs mature forest, and the grasshopper sparrow needs grasslands. Some species are generalist. They can occur anywhere. Finally, paleosuccession, there's changes over a long geologic time. And often these are determined by pollen studies.